Dr. Jaclyn Geller is a reader, writer, and professor. She professes at Central Connecticut State University and specializes in restoration and 18th century literature. Geller earned her doctorate in English and American literature at NYU. She is the author of Here Comes the Bride, Women, Weddings, and the Marriage Mystique, as well as articles on early modern satire, Samuel Butler, and Samuel Johnson. She lives in Central Connecticut and New York City with her family and friends.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And latecomers, come on in, grab some popcorn, make yourself comfortable. I'm happy to have you. And thank you, Professor Gigliotti, for steadfastly organizing this event and for pulling it all together on top of all the other amazing things he does, and for inviting me to participate. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, very briefly, and then read a little bit from my most recent book. And I'll start with something that's coming up a lot these days in the news, unfortunately, the terrible days after September 11th, 2001. We hear a lot, that continues to resonate for all of us. And one thing I'd like to bring to your attention before I start to read is something that is basically a buried news item. After September 11th, after the terrible attacks in those awful days, Congress established a victims' compensation fund. Please come in and sit down, any latecomers. Congress established a victim compensation fund for the loved ones of those who had been killed in the attacks. Heading it was a married lawyer named Kenneth Feinberg. He had done this kind of work his whole career, and he seemed to be the appropriate person for this terrible task of assigning a cash value to a person's life, which is basically impossible. How he approached it was he calculated a sum based on projected lifetime earnings, as well as other financial assets that the deceased person might have. Then what he did was not publicized. He simply divided the married from the never married, unmarried, never to be married people, and he added $50,000 to every married person. Come on in, Susan. And that went to the widow or the widower of each deceased victim. No person who cared about a victim, a firefighter, a priest, and there was a beloved one, Father Michael, we just all called him, who ran in when everyone else was running out to do the last rites on firefighters who were dying, and was killed by a piece of ceiling that came over his head. He wasn't married. No person who, and he had family, no person who cared about someone who died in those attacks but was not married got that $50,000. A best friend of 35 years was trumped by a spouse of 1 week. I think that this is why I wrote the book, not because of that event, but because it seems to me that this exemplifies our country's continual valuation of form over function. Rather than looking at quality of relationship, we look at whether it's got licensure. And it seemed to me an incredibly depressing and awful decision that Feinberg made, not that I would ever minimize the difficulty of the task he was assigned. What's also important is that the Victims' Compensation Fund, come on in, bud, declared in very cold, hard numbers that today, in modernity, the life of a non-marital person is worth less than that of a spouse. That was made extremely clear in cold, hard numbers. And it also clarified something else, which is America's overweening value of the spousal relationship. Its consideration that that relationship is worth more than any other. And I guess what my book tries to emphasize by going way back into classical antiquity, when people, and we have a distinguished classicist among us, Dr. Gigliotti, when people would be referred to as friend of Alcibiades or friend of Pericles. That was often, they weren't referred to often by their spousal designation. Or in the whole Middle Ages and Renaissance, when there was a powerful cult of friendship, when informal adoptions were very common, when, and this sounds strange today, the highest thing you could be was celibate. Married was sort of, for a long time, sort of a poor person's compromise. Not that this was necessarily better, but I just think we should acknowledge that it was different. And that these values that we have today that determined Feinberg's choice are new. We shouldn't read them back as old and perpetual and timeless. We should be aware of the assumptions that went into that choice. The other thing that I kind of wonder is, where were the marchers? Where were the demonstrators? Where were the non-married people with placards? Nowhere. No one was saying, why don't non-marital lives count as much? Because the story was buried. It didn't get any press. It wasn't considered important enough to report. Last night I ran a Google search. The only thing I could find on it was an interview with Kenneth Feinberg saying how proud he was of the work he had done in 9/11, and looking back how hard that committee worked. I had to research hard to find this. And when I tell people of that $50,000 discrepancy that was knee-jerk, they don't believe me, but it happened. I had to go into books and academic journals to find it. And so please, when I talk about this, I exemplify what Professor Kaponanya, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, Kaponanya Matsumara has written about as the constitutional right not to marry. And this is something that we've heard about, right to marry over the past 10 years. Well, there's another constitutional right that he says is nested in the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution's First Amendment, which is the right not to marry. And for those of us who've tried to put a loved one on their health insurance and found that we couldn't, because now everyone supposedly can get married, that right is painfully real. Okay, so I'm going to start reading, and I'm just going to read a little bit about the post-war, when a lot of this marriage mystique that I write about intensifies, and then I'll stop and we'll do some Q&A, hopefully. Brave World War II soldiers heard that they were protecting marriage. The government-sponsored 1942 radio show called To the Young features an earnest young man telling a young woman that the war effort is, quote, about love and getting hitched and having a home and kids and breathing fresh air out in the suburbs, end quote. One war bonds advertisement features the painting of a woman perusing a fashion magazine. The framed photograph of her soldier beau sits on a table behind her. Will you do without an evening gown today for a wedding dress tomorrow? The copy reads. Investing in war bonds, not clothing, meant investing in marriage, such ads insisted. What the country was fighting for, explained, and this is what the country was fighting for, explains historian Vicky Howard. Mid-century exaltations of marriage are offensive because so many non-marital people participated in the war effort. Rita Levi-Montalcini grew up in Turin. She earned an MD at the University of Turin, but lost her job when Benito Mussolini's 1938 Manifesto of Race robbed Italian Jews of their livelihoods. She persevered, building a makeshift laboratory in her bedroom and studying chicken embryos and their nerve fibers. Levi-Montalcini then practiced as a physician in Florence, treating refugees who poured in from Northern Europe. After the war, she resumed her cellular biology research at Washington University, ultimately isolating a protein that stimulates nerve growth. She won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1986. A lot of today's marriage movement propagandists, and this is a movement that's self-named, it started in the year 2000 in this country, and they tout health as wedlock as a health enhancer. That extends life expectancy. Well, Levi-Montalcini confounds their claims. She remains the oldest Nobel Prize recipient, having died in 2013 at age 103. In 1944, German forces invaded Hungary. During their occupation, a Swedish diplomat, in air quotes, Raoul Wallenberg, arrived and began issuing passports to Jews whom he identified as Swedish subjects awaiting repatriation. He rented some 30 buildings and designated them extraterritorial, which gave their occupants diplomatic immunity. Omitting to mention his connection to the Allies, the never-married Wallenberg hung signs advertising these buildings as libraries and research facilities. No one knows how many lives he saved before he disappeared, probably at the hands of Soviet captors, but the buildings alone housed minimally 10,000 Jewish people. Such heroism did not dent wartime matrimania. Film scholar Janine Bessinger writes that movie audiences not only wanted to believe in marriage in those years, they needed to believe in it, and Hollywood obliged. Director William Wyler set his film Mrs. Miniver in a London suburb, where architect Clem Miniver, played by Walter Pidgeon, and his wife Kay, played by Greer Garson, deal with their oldest joining the army. They care for Toby and Judy, the two youngsters at home. Both 42 when the film was shot, Pidgeon and Garson look youthfully, maturely stunning. This fit Wyler's conception of responsible people made more responsible by marriage. In one scene, Clem and Kay respond to a German air attack by ushering the children into an Anderson bomb shelter. Working as a synchronized team, they coolly help each child through the ordeal. Wyler's message is clear. When soldiers fought on the front lines, marriage preserved stability at home. Post-war clinicians gave marriage the hard sell. Paul Popenoe authored a 1950s Ladies' Home Journal column thrillingly entitled, "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" A college dropout who boldly designated himself Dr. Popenoe. Is boldly the word? I mean, that was kind of an amazing thing he did. Okay, he called himself Dr. Popenoe, never finished college. He founded the Hollywood-based American Institute of Family Relations, sometimes called the Mayo Clinic of Marriage. This facility employed 37 counselors and advised over 1,000 couples per year. Popenoe set its tone, philosophizing, quote, a motherhood fixation is responsible for the celibacy of many old bachelors who might otherwise be superior husbands, end quote. Stereotypes of unwed men as oddballs, stunted by mommy love, enabled him to bachelor batch ad libitum. David Levy, a Columbia University clinical psychiatry instructor, claimed that marital sex protected children's mental health. Levy's book, Maternal Overprotection, suggested that marriage cured a number of maladies. Quote, a wife devoted to her husband cannot be exclusively a mother. The release of libido shunts off energy that must otherwise flow in the direction of maternity, end quote. Levy based his statements on a survey of 20 women, his patients, and there was no comparative focus group. It was sort of a marvel of scientific obfuscation. By making prejudice sound scientific, figures like Popenoe and Levy became Dions. They benefited from the widespread respect accorded Sigmund Freud, whose theories loomed large. Even those who had never read Interpretation of Dreams felt as if they had. Americans heard that dreams opened passageways to reservoirs of desire. They knew that a prestigious treatment involved lying on a couch and talking to someone credentialed who could extract motives from the associative ramblings. Freud's theories have since been discarded. A model of the mind based on metaphors, id, ego, superego, is quackery. Freud claimed that male maturation involved falling in love with one's biological mother and having this reverie shattered by a menacing father figure who would become an emulative model. He did not discover this Oedipus complex in a research environment, but recalled it. In an 1897 letter to a friend, Freud wrote, I have found in my own case the phenomenon of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and I now consider it a universal event of early childhood. American clinicians normalized Freud's extremely weird version of childhood, accepting it as a series of phases that made people marriageable. Here is America's preeminent post-war child-rearing expert, Dr. Spock. Quote, "We believe that a boy's attraction to his mother in the 3 to 6-year-old period is vital in establishing an idealistic romantic pattern for his future life as an adult," end quote. Legitimated by Freud, mid-century marriage propagandists had a field day. Psychiatrist Marnia Farnham and her partner Ferdinand Lindbergh's 1947 hit, The Modern Woman, characterizes an independent female as a contradiction in terms. They labeled feminism a deep illness caused by wrong-headed women's desire to emulate men. Married female professionals were driven by, what else? The wish to castrate their husbands. Farnham and Lundberg told women to stop all this career building and penis snipping. It distracted from their true vocation, marriage. These great luminaries considered never-married women emotionally unfit to teach children. They actually suggested putting an official ban in place to prevent us from teaching. They overlooked myriad non-marital female educators. Lucy Craft Laney, born 1854, died 1933, was born to formerly enslaved people. She founded the Haynes Normal Industrial School in Augusta, Georgia, America's first black school. Its curriculum included English, math, physics, chemistry, German, and French. Laney taught in this school. Her fundraising sustained it, and she served as its principal for 50 years, inaugurating America's first African-American kindergarten class. If it had been up to them, she wouldn't have been able to teach, because she never married. Matrimonial advisors downplayed such pioneers and focused on helping women hook husbands. "It's up to you to earn the proposal," declared journalist E. Michelle in 1951. Michelle explained that any gal with a beau must promote herself in particular and wedlock in general. In 1953, psychiatrist Sidonie Gruenberg warned that, quote, "A girl who hasn't a man in sight by the time she is 20 is not altogether wrong in fearing that she may never marry," end quote. In colleges, marriage textbooks, marriage classes achieved great popularity with female students. Textbooks like Toward a Successful Marriage met co-ed's demand for matrimonial instruction. Curricula of schools like Stevens, University of Iowa, and Boston College included nuts and bolts marriage preparation. And I'm just going to add here a little aside, which is this mainly came from requests from the student body because they wanted what was relevant. So sometimes we as professors hear these requests. We want what's relevant. What's relevant can look very irrelevant 20 years later, which is why sometimes it's good to trust the people like Dr. Gigliotti who studied the text and read the classical languages and it's a strange shifting situation, relevance, and it's an odd term. But this, there were female undergraduates who got degrees from these schools, which were not small schools, for babysitting and for doing home economics, doing things like laundry. So let's just keep that in mind when we think about relevance. Network television was similarly prescriptive. Set in the fictitious town of Springfield, Father Knows Best starred Robert Young as Jim Warren, an insurance company manager married to Margaret, played by Jane Wyatt. Jim sagaciously counsels the 3 Warren kids, Princess, Bud, and Kitten. Margaret appears in the morning fully made up. Hi, Mary. Fully made up, wearing a wide-skirted dress, heels, and a pearl necklace as if heading off to a gala. This is quite an ensemble for the task of handing Jim his briefcase. But advice columns told wives to rise early and prettify themselves for their husbands. When she is not caring for her brood, Margaret sits on a sofa reading magazines. This was the good life, post-war American style. 2/3 of females who began college in the 1950s dropped out, usually to marry. Belief in the husband, breadwinner, wife, homemaker household had never been so widely shared by people from different regions, classes, and cultures. Sociologists liken this consensus to a bulldozer that obliterated every alternative view. It raised a path from America's cities to its suburbs. The suburban population increased from 36 million to 72 million denizens. Concurrent birth rates rose. By 1957, America saw 129 births for every 1,000 women, a sharp increase from the previous decade. By the century's end, 90% of Americans were marrying. Sitcoms normalized the separate spheres ideal. However, a backlash may have occurred. Some social historians believe that media representations of domestic bliss generated discontent. These began rising in 1957. Actually, 1 out of every 3 couples who wed in the 1950s, America's golden age of marriage, eventually divorced. Still, glad to be married propaganda, it proclaimed a glorious new age of conjugal enmeshment. It told unmarried that their lives were hollow. The tax code solidified this message. In its initial dictate for federal income tax, relationship status played no role. Each person was taxed independently. In 1948, Congress decided to give married couples a combined tax return option. Spouses could file as split-income households, dividing their lump sum earnings in half, which generally resulted in lower federal taxes. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there, because I think people can only sit and listen to reading for so long. And I guess I thought we might have Q&A or just a conversation. I'm aware that my views are not necessarily the popular ones, but I feel that they are important, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are, and if I can. I see some of my students have turned up. Professor Collins, thank you for being here.
Thank you for writing this book.
Thank you for urging me to write this book.
No, I'm so excited to be here. I'm sorry I'm a little late. I have a question, though, that just like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think it was the New York Times, but at a big study that also included a lot of statistics about what happens, especially to women of color who are single parents. And because they're not married, they phrase it, because they're not married, they don't do this. And they also listed all these terrible statistics about what happens because they don't have a marriage partner. How does your book frame the counter-argument? Like, even though those things are true, what are the frameworks in society that are contributing to the way they frame it? Like it's because they're not married that they don't. Yeah,
that's an old chestnut. It's a very large question that I deal with in the book when I describe how the black family has borne the brunt of America's anxiety about non-marriage by being continually pilloried, either by well-intentioned people such as Senator Moynihan, when he wrote the sort of infamous Moynihan report, how can we help these poor black people get married, get them all married, and then all their problems will sort of magically vanish. This goes back to the post-Civil War period when many formerly enslaved people, and I would rather not use the word African American because black people did not become full citizens until 1868 in this country, but many formerly enslaved black people ran away. And there were encampments all throughout the South set up by the Northern soldiers, and they were to take these people who were starving, tortured, had dysentery, didn't have shoes, were running with sores on their feet, were dehydrated, as long as they got married. Marriage was, the Eaton, who was, Gil, you can't make this stuff up. No, Eaton, the head of the camps, said we must provide for these terribly oppressed people housing, medical care, and education and marriage. That was slid in on a cadence as though it was the same thing. How, I've wondered, you're looking at people scarred from repeated beatings, starving, passing out, diarrhea, dysentery, unable to raise a bottle of water to their lips, and you're saying, let's get them married. They're a couple. They're a man and a woman entering the camp. We get them married. They enter the camp, and their idea was very much it'll make them civilized And that word still keeps being. So when the Times does that, it's participating in such a racist legacy, it's constantly doing it, always. Now, the marriage movement has influenced this with a lot of bogus studies. And I think that one of the things that frightened Moynihan, and that has frightened many people who look at the black family, I'm not an expert on this, but I did write quite a bit about it, is that we have some very strong black women figures who buck that stereotype. Oprah Winfrey is the most obvious. She lives with her boyfriend, but she has been very, very, very strident about the fact that her best friend, Gayle King, is of equivalent status in her life. She calls the girls in the academy that she founded in South Africa her daughters. She doesn't qualify that at all. She always has a few of them living with her. She is completely financially independent. She is a powerhouse. She was born out of marriage, and she has said that she and Stedman Graham will never marry. And she says it unapologetically, and it's just, you know, when a woman like Anita Hill is called a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty, by someone who has never met her, by a journalist who has never met the people he traduces, who are her supporters and friends. She's been in an LAT relationship with her boyfriend, Chuck Malone, for 20 years or so. She has close friends in academic community. There is not a crazy bone in her body. If you listen to her talk, she's one of the most centered, calm people. And a woman like Condoleezza Rice gets to go home after a hard day of work and learn from no lesser a gentleman than Robert Woodward that she has no life. As he kindly told Larry King in an interview, well, you know, Condoleezza is great, she has no life, so she's a perfect fit for that job. The phrase "has no life," it explains to me, it occurs to me as hard to interpret positively, but I'm just trying to think of, so I think that's part of it. There are a lot of female-headed households in the black community, and I think that's also been a source of, you know, threat. And I think that there are also just informal caregiving arrangements starting in the post-bellum period and up till today. It's very common for black people, youngsters, to call all their caretakers aunt or uncle, which is I think it's a beautiful thing. One of the things that frightened post-bellum authorities so much is that black couples thought that they could just split up if they wanted to. And they called these sweetheart arrangements. They didn't call it living together. They thought they had the nerve to think they could actually just break up the way we do today. So I think the Times is participating in a disgusting legacy. And I think that when you tell women to get married, you might want to look at some of Bella DePaulo's statistics, which show that 2 years of college education, 2 years, you don't even have to have the degree, will have a better chance of lifting a woman out of poverty than anything else. And yet marriage movement proponents, starting with George W. Bush, discouraged going to college, and they encourage all women to get married, black, white, and as if that's going to solve all their financial problems. Well, marriage is a subsidized institution, but no. So that's kind of a long answer. Okay, I'm not a specialist in this, but there's no way to not deal with race when you're writing about non-marriage. Yes, sir?
I have one question to understand and
sure.
Another question. The first question is, are you against the privileges that are attached to marriage, or are you against the idea of living together as a family? That's the first question.
That's an incredibly great question.
And the second question is, like she referred the enslaved people during the families were broken to weaken the people there. So people saw some value in the family.
Of course.
In the family. That's why they broke them down.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to kind of go in a chiastic fashion and move backwards. So, I mean, I basically think many men, despite these mandates, many formerly enslaved people wanted to marry for the reasons you talked about, but also because, frankly, it was the first time many of them would be making a legal oath as an enfranchised human being, and how incredible that must have felt. Absolutely incredible. What happened was, though, very nastily, and is now happening in California with other groups. States began passing laws that automatically married people who were living together and didn't tell them. And so many black couples who did not want to marry were suddenly accused of bigamy, adultery, and imprisoned. This is an extremely strange thing, given a blacksmith like Sam Means, who lived in Georgia, was living with a woman, and he was put in jail, and then I think he was put on a chain gang for not marrying her. Now, he could not read. He was a formerly enslaved human being, and he could not read, and no one stopped by to tell him about the new laws in North Carolina. Certainly nobody in Georgia. He couldn't read the paper. So what do we have with something like that? This kind of enforced marriage. Now, it's happening in California since Obergefell versus Hodges. People who live together for a certain amount of time, straight and gay, are automatically married. There's this automaticization of marriage, and they find themselves often not knowing. They're informed by a letter, but the letter doesn't always come. So suddenly they're subject to all the things that they wanted to avoid by just cohabitation, which means if they break up, the government gets right in and assigns who gets what and what can assign so much as how much of your salary you collect, whether you get to keep your car, a gift, California's joint property. They are suddenly subject to a whole host of restrictions that the privileges are based on, such as lifelong monogamy, which many couples might not want to do. They may be consensually non-monogamous. There are still anti-adultery laws in this country. Their tax situation changes. Everything changes, but no one has told them. So I think that when we get into a default to marriage or lose everything or automatically marry, which was done to many, many black people after the Civil War, we're leaving people in a terrible spot. Now, in terms of I personally don't think the privileges of marriage can be detached from the institutional history. So I would say that I think we have to kind of break the frame of the institution. I think Cass Susteen, who teaches at Harvard Law School, has just suggested that couples stop licensing marriage, that the government just gets out of the regulating sex business. And I think if we did that, people could live together. There are some households that I think would look pretty married. I'm not against love, that people would live together and enjoy all the fruits of that, comforts of that kind of relationship, but other people such as myself would be free to configure our households as we would like to, which are more friendship-based households. And there'd be no distinction between those households and someone who's celibate chooses to live alone. As long as I think we have to focus on love, longevity of relationship, shared resources, shared values, shared commitments, and the aspiration to permanence. When Miguel Braschi, a guy who's had cared for his partner in the late stages of AIDS, won the right to keep the lease on their rent-controlled apartment in Manhattan after his partner died, the New York State Supreme Court said, we're not giving him this lease because he is married or not married or in a couple. It's because he's a member of a family. Whose family if it's not someone who takes care of you in the last stages of AIDS, right? So, Doreen, I want to talk to you, but...
We got one more question, but then the conversation can continue.
Okay.
You want to ask someone else?
Well, I have a student who's asking a question, but my lovely colleague Susan Gilmore is here, and all right, I'm going to...
With your student, I just, if there's an opportunity to follow up, I just would say, one, that whole 50s thing is also backlash against Rosie the Riveter, a totally different model of
Absolutely.
what women are to do. And maybe informally, I have some questions about whether pressure to marry was harder on women than men.
Okay.
But
You really emphasized that, and Dr. Collins too also emphasized that marriage has become, in a way, ever since the Civil War, a way to empower the government, as he said, that to keep families apart so they can have more individual control over each person. And I'd also like to make another connection that I believe has had a much bigger impact these recent years. After World War II, the government instituted the welfare state, which was all by good intentions originally, up until the point where marriage is used, or is currently being used today, as, for example, I'd like to think of it. I've been studying the Army, and what I noticed a big trend is they advertised getting married, because then their income on the government stipend would increase.
Okay, so I'm just going to cut you off a little bit, because I think I know where your question is going. Married soldiers are in a completely different category than unmarried soldiers, as Harper's has reviewed. An 18-year-old, let's say, unmarried soldier will be sharing a barrack with a 27-year-old unmarried soldier. The married couples are given different salaries. They're given they get subsidies for housing, help buying homes. There are special meetings for married that deal with spouses and how to tell spouses if a regiment is deploying, and everyone is required to go to those, even the unmarried. And so several unmarried soldiers anonymously have recently written about how unfair this is, who have distinguished themselves by serving abroad, who have girlfriends or boyfriends and don't want to marry, and feel that the Army is completely bigoted in this way. And this was in my book, and I should sell a few books here. In my book, what I call this is non-marital prejudice lurks in unexpected corners. And the first place I mention is the American military, because I was startled when I read that. So thank you for the question. And Susan, in terms of the pressure on women, I would just say that, yeah, there probably was more pressure on women, but I think the Freudian idea that unmarried men were sort of stunted developmentally was not flattering. And I think the idea that bachelors, if I had to sum it up, is women are losers and loners, men are immature babies who are coddled by their mommies. And these are not, none of this is true, and none of it is fair. And I think we need to represent men in this conversation. They're terribly unrepresented. Okay.
On that note.
Thank you.